and then I will post it on an LSU link for anybody that wants to misses this or wants to download it or whatever. The session from last night last week I posted also, so that's available. I don't know how long to keep these up there, but before I actually start talking on tonight's planned topic, Laura St. Clair wanted to have a minute to make an announcement.
I'm not sure how many of you got the message from Joella Holman that she's retiring September 17th, which is about a month and a half earlier than she thought she would be retiring. And then today we had a Living Waters network coordinating team Zoom, and apparently all 61 of the 62 systems in Cuba are functioning. The only one that isn't is Union de Reyes, because they don't have water to purify. They have to have their water trucked in, and for some reason they're not receiving the shipments right now. And I thought this was interesting. Before the storm, they had all the systems produce water, put it in their tanks to keep their tanks from blowing away, and also so that after the storm, if they lost power, they would have purified water for at least a day or so. So I thought that was really interesting how they prepared. So that's it. I don't want to take too long.
Okay. My plan is, I'm sort of doing this by the seat of my pants, but my plan next week is to talk about the Presbyterian Church in Cuba. And then somewhere before too much longer, I haven't gotten around to talking to Carl, but since you're here, Carl, let me know when you feel ready to talk about agriculture. If 2 weeks from today would work, or if you want to do later, just let me know.
Okay.
And we'll plan.
I think even, yeah, two weeks is probably good. I've been reading up on some things, so.
And did you get the file that I sent you?
I did not download it.
Okay.
No, but.
There's some resources there you might find useful.
Okay, very good.
Okay, so I want to share my screen. And let me find here we go, right here. Come on. And let me ask if this will pop up here. Does my mouse show up moving around now? It was a problem last week. Can you see that moving?
Yes. Yes.
I had changed it on my computer because the white mouse never shows up well on the white background. I could never find the mouse, but apparently it created some problems. So let's go ahead and get started. The plan today is to talk about the history of Cuba. And I've got some caveats I've got to do up front here. First of all, I am not a historian or an historian. I don't know what the historians prefer in terms of a versus an, but I am not one of them. The second thing is I want to bring in a quote that was attributed to Winston Churchill, but it turns out others before him had said the same thing. But the quote is, "History is written by the victors," which means that participants in historical events might have a completely different perspective on the event from what we think we know today. Also, it's certainly not out of line to acknowledge that the politics of the present certainly can shape our perception, our understanding of the current record of history. And this seems to be especially more so the case for events happening in recent times. And to me, the clearest example of that was when I visited the Museum of the Revolution in Havana on one of my more recent trips with the group from Lafayette's church. As we went through the Museum of the Revolution, everything from the Bay of Pigs, which is justifiable, but also hurricanes and drought were the fault of the CIA. So different people may put different spins on what they call history. The historians generally are going to try to go to original sources, try to do their best job to identify the truth about history as much as they can. And of course, history hasn't ended. We are just in a point in the timeline of history. So there's still plenty to go. So here's an outline of topics that I wanted to touch on, and I have to admit, to cover multiple centuries of history in 1 hour is pretty much impossible. And I found an excellent webpage put up by the BBC. And it was essentially a timeline of the history of Cuba. So I tagged their postings. It's just a bunch of bullet points under these different topics listed here. I added the first one and I added the very last one, but the rest are from that BBC page. And so that I use this BBC page on the Cuba profile and timeline. I also found an interesting page. It's cubahistory.org, and it is written from within Cuba. Sometimes it's a little bit hard to follow because the English people writing in English where their original language is Spanish, it's not always clear to me what they're saying, but it's still an interesting source. So let me start off, and I want to talk about, to begin with, about the pre-colonial era. The people that were on the island that we know as Cuba came in 3 different waves. Most of them came from South America, also some from Central North America. So in the time period of 5,000 to 3,000 BCE, and I don't want to speak down to anybody, but in case you're not familiar with this terminology, BCE stands for before the Christian era. Just saying BC is sometimes offensive to some people who are not Christian, so that historians and a lot of science groups also have adopted this terminology. So this is equivalent to 5,000 to 3,000 BC. And there was a wave of indigenous people that came from Central, South, and North America. They were what are called Paleo Indians, although some object to the use of Indian there, but they were Stone Age people known as the Guanahatabe, and they mostly were located toward the western end of the island, and these people were fisher persons and hunter-gatherers. Then several thousand years later, from 1,000 to 500 BCE, there was a group of Meso-Indians, by certain cultural anthropologist terminology, I guess, were also Stone Age people. They came from South America, and they were the Chiboni people. They also were concentrated in the West, and they also were hunter-gatherers. And both of these groups tended to cluster in small family-sized groups rather than communities. And then the next group were the Neo-Indians. And starting about 300 BCE, there was a group known as the Taino that came from South America. They were farmers. They developed various trades. They lived in village-type housing organizations. And it's actually the Taino that were the primary inhabitants when Europeans arrived on the island, so when the Spanish showed up. One of the words for this island in the Taino language is Cubanacan, which is the origin of the name for Cuba, which the Spanish colonialists tried different names for the island, but they ended up going back to this one. And I was very surprised to learn that there's some other surviving Taino words that we use all the time, which includes barbecue, canoe, and hammock. As different groups came to the island, the Taino intermarried with African slaves and with Spanish colonists. So that effect, along with just the colonial suppression of the indigenous people, greatly reduced the number of Taino people to near extinction. There are still groups in Cuba now that identify as Taino, but it's a very diffuse group of people, and it's very small in numbers. There was one other Neo-Indian group that came into the Caribbean at about 1000 CE in the Christian era. I'm sorry? Okay. And these were called Caribs. Caribs, I'm not sure. And they actually displaced the Taino on the islands of Trinidad and the Lesser Antilles, but did not have much effect on Cuba. So the Taino were the predominant pre-colonial, pre-Columbian peoples on the island of Cuba. So starting with the bullets from that BBC page I told you about, the colonial era started when Christopher Columbus landed on the island on October 28th of 1492. His name in Spanish is Cristobal Colon. So the name of Cologne that's near our partner church is named for him. And the Italian is Cristoforo Colombo. But of course, we have to anglicize everything. So he's Christopher Columbus in our books. But he arrived in 1492 in Cuba and claimed the island for Spain. And things sort of progressed along for a while. By the year 1511, the actual conquest of the island by the Spanish happened under a guy named Diego de Velázquez, who established Baracoa, which is a community in what is now Guantanamo province on the southeast end of the island, and established several other settlements. In 1526, the importation of slaves from Africa began, but it's very clear that prior to that, enslavement of the indigenous people was taking place also. So slavery was not suddenly present in 1526. So the Spanish are ruling this island under de Velázquez, and of course, in the New World, there's battling between the British, the Spanish, the French, and the Portuguese for their different colonies they start. And in 1762, the British actually took over the city of Havana, arriving on the landmass that's on the north side of the Bay of Havana. But they didn't maintain control for very long. They agreed with Spain to return Havana by a document called the Treaty of Paris. So the Spanish led for quite a while. So that was 1763. About a century later, the people who lived on the island of Cuba, mostly Cuban-born people and other wealthy natives, fought a 10-year-long war of independence from Spain. It's called the 10-Year War of Independence, also called the Great War or the War of 1868. And this 10 years of fighting eventually led Spain to say, oh, enough, we're going to reform, you'll have more autonomy. So the fighting ended for a while, but the Spaniards did not meet most of their promises. 1886, slavery was abolished. I don't know the background on that. That's something I'd like to look into and maybe find out more of what was behind it. And I recognize that official abolition probably did not mean that slavery ended officially. I mean, unofficially, it probably continued to happen to some extent. So we had this 10-year war, 1868 to 78. When the Spanish did not live up to their promises, the Cubans started a second war of independence. It was led by a man known as Jose Marti. This was part of what we call the Spanish-American War. The Cubans call it the War of Independence against Spain. And as part of this, the Spanish-American War, from our perspective, the U.S. declared war on Spain. And in 1998, actually defeated Spain. And Spain, as a result, gave up all claims to Cuba and ceded it all to the United States. So we're right about at the turn of the century. We're right about 1900 here. Now, Jose Marti lived 1853 to 1895, and that 1895 is right in the midst of the Spanish-American War. Jose Marti is in Cuba is viewed as sort of equivalent, their equivalent of a mixture of George Washington and Abraham Lincoln. He's the national idol or national hero of the country. He was a poet, a philosopher, an essayist, a journalist, translator, professor, and publisher. But he was also very important in planning this revolution. He was a leader in the planning and execution of this revolutionary war against Spain. He also was a major player in designing the ideology of what became the Cuban Revolutionary Party. He died near the end of that revolution against Spain in the Battle of Dos Rios, or the Two Rivers, in 1895. So he has a major reputation and is honored by the Cubans because of his role in the revolution. But he's also recognized within and without Cuba as a major turn of the century intellectual in the Latin American countries. Here are some pictures of him. The one on the left is, I don't know if that's a daguerreotype or what it is, but sees him as probably a young man not long before he died. Last week, I showed you the image in the upper right corner. Does the mouth show up there?
Yes.
Okay, so that's the Revolutionary Plaza, and that's the memorial to the gentleman there. It's quite large. And below is a typical bust that you will see all through Cuba. Any city will have several of these, many of them made of a heavy-duty white plastic. But he is truly considered the hero, the father of modern-day Cuba. So we had the Spanish-American War. Spain ceded control of Cuba to the United States. So in 1902, Cuba became independent, and their first president was Tomás Estrada Palma. But we have something called the Platt Amendment, which was a part of a U.S. appropriations bill for the United States Army in 1901. And this bill that was passed by Congress stipulated 7 conditions that Cuba had to meet in order that U.S. troops would withdraw from Cuba. And so this Platt Amendment kept the island under U.S. protection, and it gave the United States the right to intervene in Cuba affairs as it saw fit. As part of this developing process, there was a lease document. I don't know if everybody signed it, but in 1903, it established what is now known as the U.S. Naval Base at Guantanamo Bay. This property in the province of Guantanamo, which is the southeast part of Cuba, is considered to be sovereign property of Cuba by everybody, but is controlled by the United States. And the Cubans consider our presence there to be illegal, and they want it to end. And actually, many in the United States would like it to end also, but it has been difficult to actually pull off a departure, in good part because it is the housing for a number of Al-Qaeda terrorists, proposed terrorists. The United States moved there after our problems with terrorism in the Middle East. And a lot of people in the legislature in the United States, as well as different individual states, have been extremely reluctant, even unwilling, to allow the United States to move people from Gitmo, from Guantanamo Bay, to prisons within the United States because of fears that this will draw terrorists in to attack these locations where they're housed. I'm not sure whether it's a defensible argument because I haven't seen any record of terrorists be attracted to Gitmo to try and free these detainees, but that's what it is. So 1902 and 1903, we've got the U.S. turning over the island to Cuba to run itself, but maintaining the right to go back and intervene if they felt the need to. And this was under President Tomás Palma. In 1906 through 1909, he resigned, and the United States came back and occupied Cuba following a rebellion that was led against Estrada by Jose Miguel Gomez. In 1909, Gomez became president following elections that were supervised by the United States, but his administration had problems with corruption. And there was unrest in Cuba. In 1912, U.S. forces came back to Cuba again to put down protests by blacks in the population of Cuba, protesting against discrimination which they were facing. So the U.S. forces are sort of overseeing things. They put down the unrest at that point. In 1924, the current president then, who was Gerardo Machado, enacted a lot of regulation of mining and agriculture and public works, trying to move Cuba into more modern times. But he operated a very brutal dictatorship, and it was not very well received. So that was 1920.
Can
Yes.
I ask a question?
Sure.
Before 1902, when did the U.S. first become involved in Cuba?
Well, but they were involved in at some point in the 1868 to 78 War of Independence, because that was also the Spanish-American War.
Okay.
So it's whenever the United States got involved in the Spanish-American War, and I didn't think about looking that up. But it's before 1898, which is when Spain was defeated by the United States in that war. And by the way, that's about the time, and we'll talk about this next week, that's about the time the Presbyterian Church started in Cuba also. In 1925, the Socialist Party was founded, which later became the Communist Party. And President Machado was overthrown in 1933 in a coup led by Fulgencio Batista. He was in the Cuban military, as it says there, he was a sergeant. And he took over. He was not elected yet. That came a little bit later. But in 1934, the United States decided to sort of wash their hands of the responsibility to intervene in Cuba's internal affairs, and actually made changes in policy to allow more sugar from Cuba into the United States and to change tariffs to be more favorable for Cuba. So it was a move that should have been beneficial to the economy of Cuba. So Batista's been running the country. He started in 1933, and for 1944, 11 years later, he retired and was succeeded by a civilian, Ramon Grauson Martin. But Batista was not very happy, and 8 years later, he seized power again and established a very oppressive and corrupt regime, which led up to the more modern era of the revolution. In 1953, Fidel Castro, who I'll talk about more, led an unsuccessful revolt attempt against the Batista regime. They landed in Santiago de Cuba province, which is down by Guantanamo on the southeast tip of Cuba. And they attacked a barracks down there and were badly beaten. And Fidel Castro and his brother Raul and several others were captured. They were tried and they were imprisoned. But their prison terms did not last as long as were originally mandated. And in fact, I'm going to talk about this a little bit more. Castro spent about a year in prison, and then he was expelled and went to Mexico. And his brother joined him there, and Che Guevara joined him there, and they formed a group to come back and attack Cuba again, which they did in 1956. They landed in eastern Cuba from Mexico, and they moved into the Sierra Maestra Mountains, which are along the Guantanamo and Santiago de Cuba provinces. And they were aided by Che Guevara. And so Castro and his revolutionaries waged a guerrilla war for a number of years. The United States got weary of Batista and withdrew all military aid to him in 1958. So let me talk about some of these people, and then I'll come back to my bullet points. Here's some pictures of Batista. He was, let me go back and pull the date. He first, where do I have Batista? I've got to.
1933.
In 33, yeah. He had a coup in 1933. But it was not elected president until 1940. Then he served from 40 to 44, and then stepped down and then came back in 1952 and was a dictator until 1959 when Castro's revolution deposed him. And interesting, I came across this picture of Batista with Richard Nixon. At the time, the relationship between the time of Batista, the relationship between the United States and Cuba was a very exploitative one. The United States drew heavily on the agricultural resources, so the sugar crops, rum. The United States brought in gambling, which brought a large mob presence. And in some ways, Cuba became a party ground, a playground for the rich and wealthy to come have a good time. The Cuban Revolution, which went from 1953 when they did their first attempt to land in Santiago de Cuba until 1959 when they finally deposed Batista. These are the identified leaders of the Cuban Revolution, and the first three are the figures that are best known: Fidel Castro, Raul Castro, and Che Guevara. Camilo Cienfuegos, I mentioned last week when I showed those wire form sculptures on several of the buildings in Havana. Cienfuegos is another one of the well-known figures. The last two on this list died during the revolution, so they did not survive. The others I have not seen much about. I don't know what role they played, except they are identified as leaders of the revolution. So let's talk about the first three. Fidel Castro was born in 1926 and died in 2016. He clearly is known as a Cuban revolutionary and politician, and he served as prime minister, and these titles get very confusing. He was prime minister of Cuba from 1959 when they overthrew Batista until 1976. And then 1976, he was elected president and served in that role until 2008. He was a Marxist-Leninist, although during the revolution, the communist perspective was kind of a low-key thing. A lot of people didn't realize that that's part of the package that came with him. But he also served as the first secretary of the Communist Party from 1961 until 2011, after he had stepped down as president. And it turns out that the first secretary of the Communist Party of Cuba is the most powerful political position in Cuba, more so than the president or the prime minister. He was the son of a wealthy Spanish farmer, and he studied law in the University of Havana. I don't know whether he actually graduated and became a lawyer, but it's well known that he studied law, and as a part of his studies, he traveled around and adopted the leftist and anti-imperialist ideas as he saw injustice throughout Cuba and other countries. And he actually participated in rebellions against right-wing governments in the Dominican Republic and Colombia. And then he planned the overthrow of Batista. And as I said, it started with that failed attack in Santiago de Cuba province in 1953, where they attacked a military barracks called the Moncada Barracks. And the date's important, July 26th of 1953, because when he resumed the attack later, after having spent some time in Mexico, they called their movement the July 26th movement. So when they had their failed attack at Moncada Barracks, and Fidel and Raul Castro and others were arrested and tried and sent to prison, after a year for Fidel and almost 2 years for Raul, they were released from prison and sent to Mexico. They were exiled from Cuba. And while in Mexico, Fidel and Raul developed this 26th of July movement, and Che Guevara joined them at that point. So they organized and planned and actually executed another attack on Cuba to try to overthrow Batista. And after a number of years of guerrilla activity, They succeeded in 1959. And at that point, Fidel Castro assumes military and political power as Cuba's prime minister. I'm uncertain whether the term president came later, because he was both prime minister and then later president. And as I said, the terminology for the government positions and the government organizations is rather confusing sometimes. Fidel almost invariably was always seen in military uniform of some sort until right near his death. And this last picture in the bottom right is one taken shortly before he died. But he was always a bearded person. He always had military greens of some sort on. His brother, Raul Castro, is still alive. He was born in 1931. Raul is the youngest of three brothers, Ramon, Fidel, and Raul. They also had 4 or 5 sisters. He also went to college, but was said to be a mediocre student, so became more politically active and became a socialist, and he joined the Socialist Youth and joined this affiliate of the Cuban Communist Party called the Partido Socialista Popular. As I already said, in 1953, he was a part of this, what became the 26th of July movement. They didn't have that name yet. But he was part of the group that attacked the Moncada barracks. And he was given a 13-year prison sentence. He only spent 22 months in prison and then was exiled to Mexico, where he reconnected with Fidel, who was there. And at that point, Che Guevara joined them. And they began planning their subsequent attack and guerrilla action to again try to get rid of Batista. And the boat that they used to come from Mexico to land in Cuba is very famous. It's called Granma. Granma is the name of an existing English language media group that provides information about Cuba. It's from Cuba, and it's an official arm of the Cuban government. But I'm able to follow that online. It's interesting to see the internal official government perspective on things that are going on in Cuba through Granma. There's also a replica of the boat Granma right next to the Museum of the Revolution in Havana. And that was a mighty small boat for all those people coming from Mexico to land in Cuba. Raul was number 2 to Fidel in the revolution, although I think Che Guevara moved up and became more of a number 2 later on. But after the revolution succeeded, Raul Castro held a variety of post-revolution leadership positions. During the revolution itself, he was involved in guerrilla actions throughout Cuba, but there are no real successful operations attributed to him. So he was sort of a steady grind guerrilla revolutionary, but with no praiseworthy accomplishments, apparently. So well after the revolution, when Fidel is prime minister and then later president, Raul continued to play a senior role in the Cuban government. And in 2006, Fidel temporarily stepped down as president, and Raul became temporary president. After I have hearing aids and my phone comes through the Bluetooth to my hearing aid, so I just had to kill a phone call. So he was temporary president in 2006, and then Fidel stepped down as president, and Raul was immediately elected for a 5-year term as president on the 24th of February in 2008. And then he is reelected for a second 5-year term in 2013. And he made it clear that he did not intend to serve more than 2 terms. And he actually retired at the end of that second 5-year term in April of 2018. So this is what he looked like. They're probably younger pictures of him, but there he is in military uniform. Once he became president, he did not seem to follow Fidel's pattern of staying in military greens. He moved more towards the business suit of other national leaders. The third of these three people that were at the head of the revolution is Ernesto Che Guevara, born in 1928, died in 1967. He was from Argentina. He was a Marxist revolutionary. He was a physician, author, guerrilla leader, diplomat, and military theorist. Was a major figure in the Cuban Revolution, is as well recognized. And it's interesting that the outline of his portrait of his head, the bust outline, I guess, is recognized everywhere. That figure is ubiquitous as a symbol of a counterculture symbol for rebellion. When Che Guevara was a medical student, he traveled throughout South America and was radicalized by all the problems he saw that were associated with the repressive right-wing regimes there. He was involved in social reforms in Guatemala until the CIA assisted an overthrow of the government that he was trying to support, and actually the death of the leader of that movement. So he migrated, ended up in Mexico City, where he joined up with the Castro brothers and joined their nascent 26th of July movement. And then they sailed to Cuba aboard this yacht Granma with the intention of finalizing the overthrow of the U.S.-backed dictator Batista. Che soon became the second in command, played a pivotal role in this 2-year guerrilla campaign that finally got rid of Batista. He seemed to like to be involved in revolution, so he left Cuba in 1965 to be involved in revolutions elsewhere, first in Congo, Kinshasa, and then later in Bolivia. And he was actually captured in Bolivia by CIA-assisted Bolivian forces and immediately executed, and was buried there. Some years later, his body's internment location was discovered, and he was exhumed, and his remains brought back to Cuba, and a large memorial and burial site was built in the city of Santa Clara, a little bit towards the east of mid-Cuba. And this is the memorial. You may notice on the column on the right, it has Hasta la Victoria Siempre. That was the phrase under his wire sculpture on the building in Havana. Yeah, victory forward always. And this bas-relief carving on the memorial is showing various stages of his revolutionary career. And Linda Walker and I actually visited this in 2012 when we were in Cuba preparing for the 2012 high school youth group visit to Cuba. It's quite an impressive large structure. It's many city blocks in size. So back to my BBC bullet points. So talking about the revolution. So in 1959, Castro led a guerrilla army of 9,000 into Havana, which forced Batista to flee. And Fidel became prime minister, Raul became his deputy, and Che Guevara became the third in command. In the next year, Cuba nationalized all U.S. businesses on the island without compensation. And there is still a lot of resentment in the United States among people who suffered loss because of that nationalization. The United States imposed an embargo on Cuba on the 19th of October, 1960. It wasn't the first embargo. There had been an embargo against Batista years before, an embargo on weapon sales to him. But this is the beginning of the embargo that has lasted now for 60 years by the United States on Cuba. A year later, Washington broke off all their diplomatic relations with Havana, and we had the unsuccessful attempt by Cuban exiles, supported by CIA supposedly, to invade Cuba through the Bay of Pigs on the south coast of Cuba. At this point, Cuba proclaimed that Castro proclaimed that Cuba was officially a communist state, and he began to develop a relationship with the Soviet Union. And not long after that, the United States discovers that the Soviet Union is deploying nuclear weapons, nuclear missiles on the island, which triggered the Cuban Missile Crisis. This is during the presidency of John Kennedy, and this is probably one of my very first memories about Cuba. Castro agreed to let the Soviet Union deploy these missiles on the island because he feared that they were going to be attacked by the United States. The United States, in turn, instituted a naval blockade of the island, and it was very heated. It was feared at the time that we were on the verge of nuclear war. It was a very high anxiety period in the history of our relationship. But the crisis was subsequently resolved when the Soviet Union agreed to remove the Cuban missiles. In turn, the United States would remove nuclear missiles from Turkey, which of course were a threat to the Soviet Union. The same year, the Organization of American States, or OAS, suspended Cuba's membership because of its incompatible adherence to Marxism or Leninism, that it was incompatible with the principles of the OAS. A couple of years later, in '65, Cuba declared that the only party in Cuba was the Cuban Communist Party. And in 1972, Cuba actually became part of the umbrella of the Soviet Union, their Council for Mutual Economic Assistance. And the Soviet Union was providing a major financial support to the island of Cuba. But when we had this blockade, this was a very anxious time in the United States history. And because of it, the blockade of the United States against Cuba, not the naval, but the economic blockade, was fairly popular, I believe, because of the threat that the missile placement in Cuba was perceived to be a risk to the United States, which it was. Now, as Cuba grew in becoming more established as an institution-managed country, they became a little bit more outgoing. They approved a new constitution in 1976. Castro was elected president at that point, so he had been prime minister. Now he's president. And then Cuba starts reaching out, and they sent troops to different places to support different revolutionary movements. So they sent troops to Angola, and later also to Ethiopia. In 1980, the Cuban government released 125,000 Cubans and allowed them to flee the United States, and they mostly left from the port city of Mariel. So these were the Mariel boat people that you may remember. In 1982, Cuba backed Argentina in its dispute with Britain over the Falkland Islands, so cementing its relationship with Central and South American dictatorships and weakening their connections to European and United States, European countries, United States. By '88, Cuba agreed to pull its troops from Angola after coming to a settlement agreement with South Africa. Now, these blue bullets I put in here relate to our church. So in January of 1988, the Presbytery of South Louisiana formed a partnership with the Presbytery of Matanzas. This was a whole new outreach, and I'll talk about this more in subsequent get-togethers. This was the first time the Presbyterian Church in the United States reached out to develop partnerships in Cuba. And the partnership between the Presbytery of South Louisiana and the Presbytery of Matanzas was the first, along with one or two other presbyteries in the United States. So our presbytery was on the leading edge here. And 2 years later, in October of 1990, University Presbyterian Church formed a partnership with Gethsemane Presbyterian Church in the small town of San Jose de los Ramos, which is in the Presbytery of Matanzas and also in the province of Matanzas. Then the Russians left, creating big problems for Cuba. So in 1991, military advisors left Cuba as the Soviet Union was collapsing, which led to a decade-long period known as the Special Period, or the Special Period in Time of Peace, which was an extended period of economic crisis that began with the loss of Soviet support, of course made worse by the embargo of the United States blocking access to products from the United States to Cuba. This special period was especially rough in the early and mid 1990s. And it continued to the end of the decade when Venezuela, in the personage of their president, Hugo Chavez, resumed a support role of Cuba. They became Cuba's primary trading partner. Of course, now, as President Trump has tried to institute, there's a phrase for this that doesn't come to mind, overturning the government of Venezuela. Trump has really cracked down on the support of Cuba by Venezuela, embargoing oil tankers and so on that were bringing supplies to Cuba, which has made things tough in Cuba again. Chavez developed cancer. He was treated in Cuba, but died of his cancer. And since his death, the support of Cuba by Venezuela has tapered off, especially harmed by the efforts of the United States to prevent oil shipments from Venezuela to Cuba. But as the embargo tightened and the economy continued to get worse in the 90s, Cuba made some efforts to change, to improve their economic condition. And during this special period, people were starving. It was the food shortages, cooking oil, rice, all kinds of food sources were in almost zero supply. And people were reverting to eating things that were not normally food service. It brings to mind the tales of cooking leather just to get something that would have a taste to it. I don't know if that has actually happened there, but I've heard tales about people having to revert to desperate circumstances to get some nutrition. But in trying to deal with this economic whammo in Cuba, the Cuban government instituted reforms. They started allowing the United States dollar to be brought into Cuba and used to purchase. They allowed many of the state-owned farms to become semi-autonomous cooperatives. And as you drive through the Cuba countryside, you will see big signs for all these different cooperatives where farmers work together. My understanding is they're obligated to sell a major portion of their crops to the government, but they're able to keep some for themselves. So there's some incentive there to be entrepreneurial. And also in this period, Cuba started to legalize limited individual private enterprise. The majority of the people in Cuba were still paid by the Cuban government. They got a paycheck no matter what they did. There was not much stratification in pay levels. Theoretically, under socialism, everybody should be getting the same. But they began to allow some of these individual private enterprises so the people who really had the industry to do so could start making money on their side. The next year, 1994, Cuba signed an agreement with the United States for the United States to actually allow up to 20,000 Cubans to arrive in the United States if Cuba would stop huger numbers from coming. There was an enormous exodus of people trying to get into the United States because of the special times. And the United States was trying to slow the flood of refugees, so they came to this agreement with Cuba. In 96, the trade embargo was made permanent, although it had been in place since 1960. But in that year, Cuba shot down 2 aircraft that were US owned. I don't know if they were US military, but they were piloted by Miami-based Cuban exiles. Up until this point, Cuba was an atheist country. I've been told, I haven't documented, but I've been told that the original Constitution, Cuba claimed itself to be an atheist country. I don't know whether that's true or not, but that certainly was the practice. And the church, all the churches in Cuba, suffered because of, if not being forbidden, certainly being discouraged. And if you were going to be a successful Communist Party member, if you were active in a church, that was kind of a career killer. But in 1998, Pope John Paul II visited Cuba, and that was kind of a landmark change in the tolerance of religion in Cuba. That same year, the United States eased restrictions that it had on the ability of Cuban Americans, exiles, to send remittances back to family in Cuba. This has been, ever since, has been a major means by which people in Cuba are able to survive, because family members in the United States send them remittances, and that American origin money helps them get the food they need and to be able to have lives that are not as horrible as they had been. Unfortunately, our current president has been clamping down on remittances again, so there are now restrictions on how much remittances can be sent to Cuba. And many of you will remember this. In November of 1999, as part of the floods of Cubans trying to leave Cuba and come to the United States, there was a family that had come on a boat that capsized. And a child on this boat survived. His name was Elian Gonzalez. He was picked up off the Florida coast. His mother and his stepfather and others on the boat had drowned. But he was survived. And he had grandparents in Florida. And the United States government turned Elian over to the grandparents. In Cuba, and of course, the Cuban exiles in Florida very strongly supported keeping him here and staying with relatives. But his father, his mother's ex-husband, in Cuba, tried to get Elian returned to him in Cuba. And this became a large legal battle, multiple court battles. It got up to the point that the US Supreme Court refused to consider an appeal from an appellate court. So Elian Gonzalez was taken from his grandparents and was returned to Cuba. That same year, in 2000, the House of Representatives approved the sale of food and medicines to Cuba. This has been going on for some time. It's for humanitarian purposes. It's certainly not an extensive amount of sale that takes place. And it has been problematic because the restraints placed on banking institutions in the United States forbid them accepting credit from Cuba. So for Cuba to purchase these food and medical supplies, they had to pay cash, which made it very difficult to be able to afford them. Cuba next began redeveloping connections with other communist and socialist countries. In December of 2000, Vladimir Putin visited Cuba and signed an accord aimed at bolstering their bilateral ties. This is after having left in the 90s and abandoning Cuba. The next year, Cuba got very mad at Russia, though, because Russia had a military base in Cuba, about 15 kilometers from Havana, called Lourdes, where they had a electronic signal monitoring station. It was the largest signal intelligence facility of the Russians anywhere outside the Soviet Union. I guess outside of Russia at that point. And the Russians removed this electronic surveillance system as a special gift to President George Bush, which made the Cubans very angry. This is quite interesting because if you ever get a chance to visit Havana and travel among the areas that have the present and former embassies, The Russian embassy in Havana has the highest building in that part of the city, where apparently they still attempt to monitor electronic signals in the United States. In 2001, November, the United States exported food to Cuba for the first time after more than 40 years, when the Cuban government requested help after Hurricane Michelle. And then we have Guantanamo Bay. In January 2002, the United States started bringing Al-Qaeda suspects resulting from the Afghan war of the United States to Guantanamo Bay for interrogation. And this was sort of an out of sight, out of mind, where they could do torture type interrogations without much oversight. And that same month, Russia closed this Lourdes signal intelligence military base completely. And in April of 2002, the UN Human Rights Commission criticized Cuba's human rights record. It was a resolution sponsored by Uruguay and supported by many of Cuba's former allies, including Mexico. And this actually led to several countries breaking ties with Cuba, including Uruguay. The United States ratcheted things up in May of 2002. The Undersecretary of State, John Bolton, accused Cuba of trying to develop biological weapons. And he added Cuba to the Washington's list of the axis of evil, which George Bush had famously developed. The same month, though, Jimmy Carter visited. It was a goodwill visit, and it was done in response to these allegations about biological weapons. And he was the first of any former or serving U.S. president to visit Cuba since the revolution. In June, the National Assembly, which is the governing body for Cuba, amended their constitution to ensure that socialism would be the permanent form of government and could not be changed. And this was in reaction to criticism of Cuba by President George W. Bush. There's always been criticism of the post-revolutionary Cuban government about their harsh dealing with dissidents. This has been something that's not very widely documented. It's known to be an issue. But in March through April of 2003, there was a particularly vicious crackdown on dissidents that led to wide international condemnation. 75 people were jailed for terms of up to 28 years, and 3 people who had hijacked a ferry to try and reach the United States were actually executed. So this is in the period where there's still a large attempted migration from Cuba to the United States. And I'd like to take a moment to recommend a book to you if you're interested in reading these. This book fairly recently came out. It's called The Cubans, Ordinary Lives in Extraordinary Times. And there's a quote from the New York Times about it. It's a description of what life was like in Cuba during this time period. It reads like fiction, and I suppose it is fictionalized history to some extent, but it actually follows actual people, including those who were executed that I just mentioned. It's focused in Guanabacoa, which is a part of Havana. It's one of the townships, one of 15 townships or city municipalities. So these families lived in Guanabacoa, and it discusses the survival of the churches in the area, people who are avid supporters of the ideals of the revolution and backing the government, and other people who are more cynical and are just doing what they can to survive. And also some families that are entrepreneurial and become quite successful. So it's an interesting book. I recommend it to you if you're interested in that kind of reading. In June of 2003, the European Union stopped all official visits to Cuba because of their human rights record, including that Black Spring. And the Human Rights Commission of the United Nations condemned or censured Cuba over its record, but barely so by a single vote. The next month in May, the United States were increased to restrict family visits from the United States to Cuba and vice versa, and also to restrict the cash remittances from expatriates. In October of 2004, Fidel Castro announced a ban on transactions in US dollars. So to make purchases, you had to use the official currencies, and there are two. There's the peso, Cuban peso used by citizens of Cuba, and then there's the CUC, or the convertible peso, that is used by visitors and tourists. Tourists are not supposed to use the peso, they're supposed to use the CUCs. And when you come to Cuba, you have to convert your US dollars into CUCs to be able to make purchases. And the conversion rate was set at $1 US equal to 1 CUC. So the Cuban currency is based on the US dollar. But Castro imposed a 10% tax on top of the conversion as a result of the crackdowns and the embargo. So when we go to Cuba, our dollars aren't equal to 1 CUC, they're equal to 90-some cents instead. Although, as I'll talk about later, Cuba just lifted that 10% tax. Continuing on under the dissidents, in January of 2005, Havana attempted to resume diplomatic contacts with the European Union, which had been frozen for 2 years. And the government actually allowed a public meeting of dissidents, 200 dissidents, which was supposed to have been the first such gathering since the revolution. So they cracked down and then they backed off. Whether it was a response to all the external criticism would be hard to argue, because they would certainly deny it. In July of 2005, they were hit hard by Hurricane Dennis. And in 2006, in February, an interesting event happened. There was a propaganda war going on. The U.S. Embassy, or Special Interests building in Havana, actually had been displaying illuminated message boards that were critical about Cuba, critical of Castro, critical of Cuban human rights. And it was displayed on the U.S., what became the embassy building, onto a large plaza where Castro used to give long speeches. So in the backdrop behind Castro was this illuminated message board, which upset them. So Castro had some changes made. And I showed this last week. He had all these flagpoles installed between the plaza, which became renamed the Anti-Imperialism Plaza, where he would speak. And all these flagpoles, when the flags were installed, would block the view of the embassy building in the background. And here's a view from within the embassy looking out at that area. So Fidel Castro's health is beginning to decline. In July of 2006, he underwent gastric surgery. And as I mentioned earlier, he temporarily turned over the presidency to Raul and then resumed it. But there was growing concern in Cuba about his health and whether he was even still alive. In December of 2006, he failed to show up at a parade marking the 50th anniversary of his return to Cuba from exile. And his absence there led to speculation about his health and whether he's even alive. Again, some crackdown. A couple people given very lengthy jail terms. One was a lawyer and one was a journalist. They were activists against the Cuban government. So this was seen as a sign that the government was cracking down again. So they tend to oscillate from cracking down, lightening up, and cracking down again. In May, another major event in Cuba is the May Day I guess all communist countries, is the May Day parade. And Castro failed to show up at that parade. And it was publicly admitted later that he'd actually had several surgical operations. Cuba was angry of an action of the United States at the time. There was an anti-Castro militant in the United States named Luis Posada Carriles, a former CIA operative, and Cuba considered him public enemy #1 because he had, they said, caused the downing of a Cuban airliner. I don't know whether that's true or not. But the United States dropped charges against him, which upset the Cuban government because the U.S. forgave this enemy. Another event without Castro, the Revolution Day celebration in July of 2007, again, Castro was not present. And finally, in December that year, a letter from Castro was read on Cuban TV saying that he did not intend to cling to power indefinitely. But he still had not been seen publicly in 6 months or more. And finally, in February of 2008, Fidel announced his retirement and Raul Castro took over as president. And Fidel had been seen as more of a hardliner than Raul, so there was a lot of hope when Raul came in as president that things would start to change. And there were some changes. And I'm sorry, I'm over again here. I'll try to wrap this up. They lifted the ban on mobile phones and computers. They started to move away from salary equality so that if you were somehow more socially important, you could get a better salary. The European Union lifted sanctions. And the government started allowing farmers in 2008 to actually obtain private land to farm on. The oil reserves in the country were thought to be greater than previously estimated, but extraction is not very successful in Cuba, although the Soviet Union has attempted to improve that. Russians visited, Chinese visited, actual Russian warships came to Havana in 2008, but the government's economy was still a mess. Two people in the Cuban government resigned and admitted that they had errors, which is political talk for they were expelled. So this is the first government reshuffle since Fidel had resigned or retired. Congress voted to lift some of the Bush administration restrictions about visiting Havana and also about sending remittances. And then in April 2009, there's this bright light. Obama says he wants to start a new relationship. There's a lot of austerity stuff going on in this period. I won't go through all these. Let me try to move on to some more of them. January of 11, Obama relaxed restrictions on travel to Cuba. So reform started in April 2011. Communist Party started allowing Cuban citizens to travel abroad as tourists. Economic reforms were begun. Cuban law was passed to allow individuals to buy and sell private property for the first time in 50 years. But even to this day, churches cannot purchase new land. They can keep the land they had when the revolution hit, but they can't buy anymore. There was a release in December of 2011 of 2,500 prisoners, mostly dissidents, as part of an amnesty ahead of a visit of Pope Benedict, who came in 2012. And when Linda Walker and I were there in spring of 2012, Pope Benedict came a week after we were there. So we saw a lot of activity, cleaning the place up and all kinds of welcoming signs for the Pope. In April 2012, Cuba allowed celebration of Good Friday as a public holiday. First time since the revolution. In summer of 2012, the UPC high school youth group visited Cuba on a mission trip with Hannah Sampson, Linda Walker, and myself as the leaders. I need to skip ahead, but let's see where we're going here. Raul's second term started in February of 2013. In April 2013, we went back and installed a Living Water for the World system in our partner church in San Jose. More changes. I'm going to try to speed through here. I apologize for being long-winded. There were rapprochements with the United States under the work that Obama and Raul Castro developed. Pope Francis supposedly played a behind-the-scenes role in this. And in January of 2015, Washington eased travel and trade restrictions. So things went on. Progress seemed to be happening. We established full relations. We opened our embassy instead of as a special interest section in Havana. My internet connection went out there for a minute. We eased trade restrictions, and things continue to improve. And in July of 16, we had the second mission trip of the UPC high school youth group to Cuba. But in November of 16, Fidel Castro died, which led to a long period of national mourning. And this is when we had change in the presidency again. So Obama left office and Trump came in. And in January of 2017, the United States ended its policy, which granted any Cuban who managed to get on the United States, it's called a dry foot policy. If you could get on dry land, you would get the ability to stay in the United States without the need for a visa. So, our government ended that policy. And then starting in June of 2017, President Trump started overturning a lot of the relaxations that Obama had instituted. In October, there was this big stink about supposed sonic attacks on the embassy of the United States in Canada. My background is neurology. I've read the scientific reports on the studies of the people that were supposedly affected, and there is nothing clear-cut there. It's still not sure whether this actually was the case. But in April of 2018, Raul Castro stepped down, and Miguel Diaz-Canel became president. So that was the end of 60 years of rule by the Castro family. And this is the current president of Cuba, Miguel Diaz-Canel. He had a long history in government. So all the leadership in Cuba has always been these old men. There was not much of bringing in younger people. So he became president in 2019, but Raul Castro kept his position as first secretary of the Communist Party. And that is the most powerful political position in Cuba. So although Diaz-Canel is president, Raul Castro is still pulling strings in the background and controlling things. But he has promised to turn this position over in 2021 also. I won't talk about this. In 2018 and 19, they tried to revise their constitution. It was problematic. There were high hopes that did not actually come to fruition. Cuba is now in another, what might be called another special period, because the economy being so bad, the restrictions in the United States, and as a step to try and improve the economy, they removed that 10% tax on the dollar to peso conversions, hoping to draw more dollars into Cuba. And they've actually opened numerous dollar stores in Cuba where you can only purchase with US dollars. So they're trying to find a source of US currency with the clampdown on tourism and travel from the United States and other countries. And these stores will also take euros and other currencies. They're trying to bring in currency that they can use to make purchases. There's still some interesting things to talk about. There was a group of Cuban spies that were captured in Miami in 1998. They supposedly have been sent here to monitor the exile opposition groups of Cuban Americans. They were caught, they were arrested, convicted, and sent to jail. They became known as the Cuban Fire. They have now all been released. I was told adamantly by people in Cuba that they were discovered because they warned the U.S. government about the 9/11 attacks that were coming up ahead, that they had intelligence about it. The
I
problem
can't hear you very clearly, George.
pardon me?
I can't hear you very clearly.
Okay, I'm sorry. The 9/11 attack was in 2001, and this group was arrested in 1998. So it's hard to understand how they're revealing plans for the 9/11 attacks led to their discovery. There's a lot more to go here, but I've way overstayed my time, and I apologize. If you want to ask questions, are there any questions that people would like to ask at this point?
The 10% tax was only on the US dollar, not on other foreign currencies?
Correct. And that now, in just the last few months, has been eliminated.
So that's why some people tried to convert their money in euros before they got there?
Exactly. If you converted your American dollars into euros, when you converted those euros into CUCs, there was no tax. My experience was that when I converted dollars to euros, my bank charged a fee. It pretty much canceled out the savings.
It also depended on how strong the dollar was in relation to the euro.
Yeah, yes.
I just wanted to say that if you're interested in learning and seeing a more, a different perspective of Che Guevara, there's a movie, I don't know if you've seen it, Motorcycle Diaries.
I've heard of it.
It's a wonderful movie. I think that gives a different perspective of who he was.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I thank all of you for sticking with me. I've got to be able to cut these down a little bit. Next week, I want to talk about the Presbyterian Church in Cuba, and we will go on from there. Thank you all. I have recorded this, and I will make this available on the LSU Files to Go if anybody wants to download it, or if there are people who missed this session.
Thank you.
Thank you all, and I'll talk to you next week.
Very good. Thank you, George.
Thanks.